So today we're going to have a Sentinel Chat, and we're going to talk about the incident that happened in Australia, in Sydney, on December the 15th, where a gunman took control of a cafe, held 17 hostages captive in a 16-hour drama that many people saw on TV, as an Iranian guy called Man Haron Monis threatened to kill hostages. Now, I wanted to get someone to talk about this, so I went through a very rigorous selection, screening, and interviewing process. Some people might even say interrogation process, but I didn't quite go as far as the CIA torture methods that we've heard about. Anyway, I came up with our own Australian resident researcher who lives in the shadow of the Urges volcano. Anthony, hello, how are you?
Hi, Scott, how are you?
Yeah, not too bad, not too bad. Celebrating Christmas over here in Thailand by sleeping most of the day.
I've heard it's celebrated with gusto there.
Certainly, it's definitely more visible over here in Thailand. Everyone dresses up. A lot of the Thais dress up in cute little costumes, red Santa costumes, and they try to sort of get in with the whole festive spirit for the tourists, I think, whereas the tourists just walk around as normal. So yeah, they really do make an effort, the Thais, to make people feel kind of Christmassy over here.
Oh, sounds like fun.
Yeah, no, it is. Yeah. And what about over there in Turkey?
Well, I mean, there's not a lot of Christmassy stuff happening in Kayseri. This time last year, I was in Ankara, and all the shopping centres went all out with Christmas decorations. In fact, my local supermarket had a huge Christmas tree outside at the front. And frolicking around the Christmas tree, they had polar bear and some penguins who have never met before. So that was a bit of a first.
Well, that's nice. That's nice to hear.
Yeah. Oh, nice. Okay, so let's talk about something a little bit less Christmassy.
Yeah.
As you mentioned, there was the siege in Sydney this month. It began on the 15th of December, which was a Monday, and it started on that Monday morning. And it ran through to the early hours of Tuesday morning. Now, it happened in Sydney's CBD, the Central Business District, which is what Sydney calls its city centre. And one of the focal points of the CBD is called Martin Place. It's like a big open pedestrian boulevard. It's got lots of boutiques and cafes and sandwich bars around it, and office towers along each side and so on. So just before 9:45 a.m. on that Monday morning, a man walked into the Lindt chocolate cafe, as in, yes, the Swiss chocolate makers. Walked into the Lindt Chocolate Cafe on Martin Place, and he pulled a gun and took everyone inside hostage. Now, around midday, it was reported that the gunman had spoken with police, and according to the media, he told them there were explosive devices planted around the city, which was very quickly disproven, by the way, and he was demanding to speak to Prime Minister Tony Abbott live on the radio. Now, Abbott didn't agree to that demand, but at around 3:30 p.m., the gunman let some hostages go, and then there were two more let go at about 5 p.m., and possibly some others. There are some other unconfirmed reports about that. After that, though, it was basically a standoff until 2 a.m. the next morning. At that point, one more hostage came out of the cafe, and a few minutes after that happened, police threw a flash grenade into the building and then stormed the building. There was an official report that about 20 to 30 rounds were heard, but later the video emerged and it showed police firing hundreds and hundreds of rounds into and inside the building. The result was, well, the gunman was killed, and so were two of the hostages, and 4 or 5 of the others were wounded. So that's the bare bones of it. But look, there are quite a lot of things about this that are highly dubious, and I mean, I don't want to give the impression that, because we're Truth Sentinel, we automatically assume there's a conspiracy behind anything like this. But seriously, when you asked me to look into it, my plan at first was just to give you a basic report and comment about the media reaction, because it was quite hysterical, and there was a lot of collusion with the government. But you know, the more reading I did, the more I just thought, well, there is something super wrong going on here. So I want to talk to you about that.
Okay, that's cool. That's cool. I mean, one thing that struck me, what you just said, there was hundreds and hundreds of rounds being fired.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Doesn't that seem a bit odd in itself? If there's one target, and you're going to storm a cafe where there's lots of hostages, and you don't want to kill other hostages, why would you ever need to fire more than a couple of shots? Because presumably you wait for that kill shot with the guy that's got the holding the hostages, and
Mm-hmm.
it should only require a couple of shots. So who are the hundreds and hundreds of rounds being fired at? Are they all just missing the target? I never quite get that.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think there was some difficulty in using snipers. I don't know the full details of that, but some reports say the gunman was getting agitated and he fired a shot in the air, and then he fired another shot at the cafe manager, a woman called Tori Johnson, because she'd tried to attack him. So it may be that the police had no option but to go in with the heavy fire, but. Look, as I said, you ended up with 3 people dead and others kind of lying around wounded in the space of 30 seconds. So it seems to me pretty much impossible that the gunman would have had time to get that many shots in. And as I said, I mean, you have to ask, did the police overdo things? Perhaps they were nervous, or perhaps there was some inexperience there. There aren't many situations of this kind in Australia.
Or maybe, or maybe that's covering fire. Basically they were trying to sort of fire to one side so that he wasn't going to come out and sort of start shooting back at them or something. I don't know. I mean, it just strikes me as odd why the need for hundreds and hundreds of rounds when you've got lots of hostages there.
I agree, yeah, and I mean, there was also, as I said, a media frenzy going on, and I suspect a fair bit of political pressure being applied as well. So I just wondered, did they end up killing or wounding civilians unnecessary as a result of all that? And we may find out more as time goes on, but I can tell you that the state police chief, Andrew Schiapponi, has done 2 things. First, he has appealed to the media not to speculate.
Which, of course, they never do.
They never would. I mean, that's just crazy talk. But secondly, he's opened an inquiry. Now, the inquiry will be undertaken by police detectives and overseen internally by a standards commission.
It's very comforting to know that they're going to have an inquiry. I'm always it always makes me feel good, because then we can get to the truth of these matters, can't we?
Yes, that was very that was a bit of festive seasonal sarcasm.
It was a bit deadpan, yeah.
But look, there's also the question about the gunman, about who he was and his motivations and so on. His name was Man Haron Monis, and he was an Iranian immigrant who had arrived in Australia in 1996. There is a narrative being built around this guy, I would say. For example, well, at first, while the siege was happening, some segments of the media were reporting that Monis was part of IS, and he did quite a few things to encourage that perception. Just a few minutes into the siege, he gave one of the hostages a Shahada flag and instructed the hostage to put it up over the door of the Lindt cafe. Now, the Shahada flag isn't the flag that IS uses, but it looks pretty similar. It's got white Arabic script on a black background. So, of course, that fueled the story. And you had one of the Rupert Murdoch papers in Sydney leading with a headline that read, IS takes 13 hostages in city siege, death cult, CBD attack. Yeah. And, of course, a lot of your Rupert readers didn't know any different, and so, the myth was born at that point.
And this flag, I mean, obviously being knowledgeable on all subjects, I know exactly what this flag means. But for those that don't, could you explain it? That was another piece of sarcasm there, by the way.
Yeah, the Shahada is it's actually just a declaration of one of the 5 pillars of Islam. The script on it says there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is the messenger of Allah. Now it's used throughout the Sunni world, the Sunni world, sorry, the Sunni world, and it's not any kind of battle standard. I guess it's the equivalent of jingle, like playing the tune of Jingle Bells during Christmas. It's not in any way offensive, although it has.
Well, jingle bells can be quite offensive.
Yeah, you hear it enough times, it does start to grate.
It does, yeah.
But recently, to be fair, some groups like Al-Nusra in Syria, they're one of the many groups fighting against the Assad regime. They have been using it as in that way, like flying it as they fly into battle and so on. So, when the flag appeared in the cafe window, it did seem like a clear indication that the guy inside was, some kind of Islamist militant. And then later on, he started using one of his hostages as a means of getting messages to the world. This is a real indicator of the times we're in. She was writing Facebook updates the whole time while she was inside the cafe. So he said, can you write some stuff for me, get some messages out to the world? And when he discovered this, he asked her to write some things for him. So there was the demand to speak to the Prime Minister. There was also a bizarre one. He asked the police to bring him an Islamic State flag, which is just weird. And he also told her to let the world know that Sydney was under attack from Islamic State. So, he was definitely trying to promote that angle. But by then, a lot more details about Monis had already emerged, and as they did come out, it just looked more and more like the real story was very different. For a start, through the years that he'd spent in Australia, he'd become more and more isolated, and especially from Muslims. At a certain point, he started calling himself Sheikh Haron, and he tried to kind of present himself as a peer of other leaders of the Australian Muslim community, but they just laughed him out of the mosque. They used to call him the fake sheikh because he actually had no followers at all, which is a bit of a problem in the shaking business. They also he was also doing some dodgy stuff, which Muslim leaders were very, very critical of. He used to run what he called meditation clinics, which were basically disguised invitations to sex. So he'd get women inside his house. He'd try to impress them with a bunch of mystical stuff from Islam and Buddhism and wherever else he could kind of scrounge it from. And then he'd suggest that the next phase of initiation would involve having a sexual experience with him. So yeah, this very much put him on the outer. And then in 2007, he started sending offensive letters to the families of Australian soldiers who'd been killed in Afghanistan. And at that point, two things happened. First, Muslim leaders really turned on him and started denouncing him publicly because that was terrible press for them. And second, he was charged with a criminal offence. Interestingly, the same offence that the Westboro Baptist Church had been charged with in America. They conducted a God Hates Fags mailing campaign there, and they were charged under a section of US law which makes it an offence to, I think, use the public postal service as a means of offending people, something like this. So the same thing with him.
I wish that would apply to junk mail.
It would be good, wouldn't it? Yeah. So look, here you had basically a public nuisance and a sexual predator. He was loathed in the Muslim community, who he claimed to speak for, unfortunately. And meanwhile, he was wanted for fraud back in Iran.
And I heard he also had 40 allegations of sexual offences against him.
That's right. He was piling up quite an impressive criminal record. And in 2013, his ex-wife was brutally murdered in a Sydney suburb. she was stabbed first and then set on fire and seemingly thrown down some stairs. And Monis's second wife was charged with that murder. Monis was charged as an accessory. But the two of them somehow managed to get out on bail, and they were fighting these charges on appeal. But just a few weeks before the siege, Monis lost the final appeal, and not surprisingly, that's quite an important element of this whole story.
That's an interesting thing. I'm not an expert on legal matters, but I thought if someone was considered a danger to society, it's pretty hard for them to get bail. And I think brutally murdering someone and setting them on fire would be one of those cases where bail shouldn't be that easy, surely.
Well, yes, that is right, and that's where the story does get a little bit suspicious, because this is not the only thing that Monis had been charged with and convicted of, but he always managed to beat the rap. He always got off with either community service or a good behaviour bond, or he managed to get bail. So it started to become a pattern with him.
Well, the conspiracist in me would say there's certain cases of people like this guy where it almost seems like they're deliberately being allowed to stay out on the streets for some kind of purpose, to be used possibly for one of these false flag situations. I mean, and I'm speculating a bit there, but I'm just saying that there are cases that just don't make sense. Why are these kind of people with so many allegations, with murdering someone, setting fire to them, and they're still walking the streets? And yeah, the conspiracist in me would say this is almost like a deliberate attempt to keep these people on the streets so that they're going to commit an offence and maybe even have some assistance in it to create a false flag event for some political purpose. But that is massive speculation. That's just me thinking aloud, basically.
Well, Scott, it's not as speculative as it may appear, unfortunately, and yet I think there's a strong case for that. And on top of everything else that I've just said, Monis had deep psychological problems, and look, people close to him have suggested that he was mentally ill and that his illness was getting worse.
I heard one report of a former classmate saying he was the maddest, most insane person he's ever met in his life.
Yeah, and his former lawyer tried to get him to undergo psychiatric treatment, but unfortunately Monis refused. The lawyer actually has been interviewed in the media and claims that Monis had some fairly horrifying experiences at one point where he did a stint in prison, like being smeared in human excrement and all this kind of stuff. And so the lawyer thinks that this really sent Monis over the edge. There's also the possibility that losing the murder trial was what set him off. But excuse me. By the way, the Iranian Foreign Ministry had actually had several discussions about Monis with the Australian government. There was they applied to have him extradited so he could be charged for fraud in Iran. But the Australian government denied that request. But then years after that, the Foreign Ministry spokesperson says she'd warned the Australians many times about his mental instability, and she'd advised them to keep an eye on him. Now, I mean, there are also people, I have to say, there are people saying it's not helpful to characterise Monis as mentally ill, because it creates this false, correlation between like mental illness and violence, which I suppose is fair enough. But in any case, he was clearly a disturbed individual,
Well, I don't know. I mean, if you're talking about someone who seems to be mentally ill and is being accused of murdering an ex-wife and setting fire to her, then I think it's a fair point, surely, that to link it to violence.
And there's an element of excessive political correctness about that.
Which we discussed before.
Say. We have, and that also, I'm sure there will be those who argue that the political correctness is perhaps the reason why he wasn't convicted and put in prison, because he was supposedly a public Islamic figure. I'm using that word in rabbit ears. So you don't want to lock him up because he'll draw accusations from the Islamic community. But that just doesn't seem very likely in this case. I mean, as I said, he was universally disliked in Sydney's Islamic community, so it's hard to imagine a backlash if he'd been put in jail. But there is a view emerging now. It's a very fringe view at this stage, because things are still quite raw in Sydney. But there is a view that Monis had been in Australia to be used by the authority to manipulate public opinion at crucial moments, and that in return for playing along, he'd been granted his freedom. And look, that may have caused him to feel kind of immune or invincible or whatever, which might explain how he kind of graduated up the chain, from fraud up to sexual assault and murder. The idea is that every time the government needed a kind of Islamic bad guy, they wheeled him out, because basically there wasn't anyone else around to do it. I mean, there was one guy on I believe it was the Australian Islamic Council in the early years of the century, called Sheikh Halili. He would occasionally, play the mad guy, like he'd threaten to put a fatwa on someone, or he'd say something terrible about women. But he was also marginalised, and he was, it seems to me, forced into retirement. But the Australian government needed people like him because, I mean, the last say 20 years of Australian government has been mostly characterised by very conservative governments who've been trying to find excuses to destroy various costly social programs and turn Australia into a surveillance society and a security state and all that stuff, And these guys, people like Monis, who can spring out and say, Australia is the new great Satan. These guys are really useful if that's what you want to do.
Well, one thing I did want to say, and I don't know if there's any point to me saying it, and I've mentioned it to you before, but and you may not notice it quite so much just because you're from Australia and you probably look at different news sources than me, but I've been struck over the last 8 months with how Australia is in the news, and Tony Abbott is in the news so much more, very noticeably more than it's ever been before, ever since the MH370 incident. It just seems like the focus has moved over to there quite a lot. I'm not sure what the reason is, but it's just something I've noticed. I wonder if anyone else has noticed that and what people might think would be the reasons for that.
Well, I think that's probably a topic for a separate discussion, and I would love to have that discussion with you, because I think one of the reasons is that the government there has become so extreme in its views and its policies that people are starting to take notice. The way people are starting to notice far right parties in Europe, like what's a name in France, Le Pen, and the Jobbik party in Hungary, and to a certain extent Australia is going the same way, and I think that's getting it some adverse media attention. It's also had Australian delegates at recent climate conferences have basically been there to shut down the conference, and that's made news. And there's an ongoing conflict between the Australian government and the UN Committee on Torture over their treatment of refugees. So yeah, unfortunately, Australia, I think you're right, Australia is popping up in the news a lot more, and not for good reasons. But yeah, look, the main intelligence service in Australia is the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation, or ASIO. We mentioned them once on the show a long time ago, and it was leaked last week that ASIO actually received a tip that Monis was going to do something. The tip clearly came from a source that couldn't be easily ignored or dismissed, because the Prime Minister actually felt that he had to speak to this in an interview. But what he said was, the tip was followed up, and it was too vague to be of any help. Which, I don't know about you, but that seems a little 9/11-y to me. What do you think?
There do seem to be patterns in some of these events, like sometimes with these sort of deranged, unstable people, or people with sort of some extremist views, who seem to be very gullible and easy to manipulate. They always seem to have, before they commit some kind of atrocity, there always seem to be some connection with the security services, with government agencies. That's one thing I've noticed in so many incidents, like Sandy Hook, the Boston bombing, this incident, 9/11. There always seems to be, situations where they kind of knew something was going to happen, but it wasn't enough to go on, like you say.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and the Prime Minister also felt last week that he needed to say that Monis wasn't on any watch lists, which is how he managed to, evade detection when he was planning the siege. Now,
why would you be on a watch list if you had 40 sexual allegations against you? You're accused of killing and setting fire to your wife, and you've made all these other threats. Why on earth would you go on a watch list?
Yeah, exactly. It's an out-and-out lie. And, the guy has a website in which he had, in the weeks leading up to the siege, been saying that Australia's going to pay and something disastrous is going to happen because of its involvement in various, wars and so on.
Our governments care about us. Sure, they sometimes make mistakes, but they want the best for us. In this world of terror, they're bringing in new laws to protect us and our families. Unemployment is at an all-time low. Prices in the shops are really very reasonable. Of course, we know this is nonsense. Governments engage in cover-ups, yet demand 24/7 surveillance of its citizens. Child abuse rings are rife, with governments spending millions on suppressing information. Planes are vanishing or being shot down. People who question facts are branded as nutty conspiracy theorists and linked to extremism and terrorism by world leaders. Whistleblowers are fleeing to Russia for protection. When Putin starts to look like the voice of reason, you know the world's in trouble. With True Sentinel, get a different perspective as we travel from the UK to places such as Ukraine, Egypt, Israel, Palestine, Thailand, Malaysia and other places. Join us as we discuss, debate and chat to guests such as L.A. Marzulli, Brian Forster, Gareth Icke, Sean Stone, Stephen Shellen, Rosemary Ellen Gooley, Douglas Dietrich, Lorianne Fenton, Sheila Zielinski, Ron Gary, Mark Cocking, Corey Washington, Pete Wickert and Sarah Bajak. 2 Real News, Seth Davis. Also our own resident researchers Anthony K. from Kayseri in Turkey and Phil G. from Portugal. On topics as varied as MH370 missing planes, Egyptian pyramids, utopian societies, anarchy, the afterlife, satanic ritual abuse, cults, the police state, drones, political correctness, nuclear meltdown, Scientology, dreams, biblical healing, prophecy, Noah's Ark, evolution, assassinations, mind control, Ukraine, freedoms, eugenics. On Truth Sentinel, we talk about a lot of stuff. And we also invite our own listeners on as guests sometimes. So if you've got something you want to talk about, get in touch. Email us, scottsentinel9@gmail.com. And come and listen to us, Truth Sentinel with Scott. You can just find us on YouTube. Search on YouTube and look for Truth Sentinel 1 or Truth Sentinel 2 channels. We're always looking for the truth behind the news. As Einstein said, the greatest enemy of truth is blind belief in authority. We don't claim to have all the answers, but we're sure as hell going to look for them. We're part of the Truth Alliance. Find us on YouTube, then click on the About section of our channel, and you'll find all the other links to Facebook channels and to our own website. Please support Truth Sentinel by giving donations. If you donate over $20 and include some for postage and packing, we'll give you a t-shirt. We need to try to buy equipment such as cameras, microphones, pay for travel. And also we've teamed up with another company, t-shirt company, who produce political t-shirts. TruthT-shirts.com. Use the code TRUTH1 and you'll get a 10% discount, and they'll donate £2.50 to Truth Sentinel. We also welcome listeners or any company with truth-related products to get in contact and advertise with us, or any sponsors who just want to share our wish to search for the truth. We never really want to get to the point where adverts dominate our channel, but we somehow need to fund it as well. It's a community show, so we welcome people to join us. Our guests are sometimes our listeners. Truth Sentinel title music was composed and performed by listeners. You can leave voicemails on our channel. Go to the About section and click on the voicemail link. Remember, email us scottsentinel9@gmail.com. Find us, Truth Sentinel with Scott, on YouTube. We thank you for your support and help.
Okay, so I hope you enjoyed the break, Anthony. Can you, what were we talking about when I left you?
We were talking about Monis and his history with ASIO, and you mentioned that this has been the case quite a lot with people and organisations who've carried out attacks. Yeah, but when you look into it, there does seem to be a history between these people and intelligence services, and it's certainly the case with Monis. When he applied for asylum in Australia back in 1996, he said that he'd done work for Iranian intelligence and that they wanted to torture him because he had sensitive information. Now, the story was, it turned out the story was completely untrue. He just made that up.
Wait, why do you think that's the case?
This is the thing. When somebody turns up from Iran making that claim, of course, the first thing that's going to happen is he's going to get interviewed by the intelligence services, and if there's any evidence of it, it's going to be splashed all over the media, because at that time, the Iranians had sort of fallen out of the limelight as far as, being the big bad guy is concerned. And I think that was at the time when nations like the US and their handmaidens like Australia were starting to try and get Iran back into the spotlight as the bad guy. So look, that would have been mercilessly exploited if there was any truth to it at all. So there doesn't seem to have been.
The point is, and I made the point fairly recently. Sometimes these guys are used by the intelligence, so they do make contact with these guys. So he may have been telling the truth. He may have been contacted by intelligence, and they may have looked at him as a potential person who could be used in some kind of political staged event. It just seems to me that that's something that sometimes the intelligence service do.
Yeah. Well, that's certainly possible, but. It leads back to the same conclusion, which is that these guys, ASIO, the Australian Intelligence Organisation, have known about him for a very long time. There's also some evidence that they regularly monitored his website, which is actually not a bad idea.
Yeah, but these days they're monitoring everybody's website, so he can join the club.
Yeah, exactly. But in fact, pretty much anything that ASIO says about this case now is suspect, because in September, when the Prime Minister came out of nowhere, it seems, and started talking about the threat of lone wolf terrorism, which, by the way, that never used to be called terrorism. That used to be called a mad guy with a gun, But now it's been kind of co-opted into this ever-widening definition of terror, So he started just talking about lone wolf terrorism, and then they passed another bill, an anti-terrorist bill, which, has some provisions in it which are kind of catch-all provisions, which can be used to prosecute people who clearly aren't terrorists. And that's been a game that this government has been playing for a long time. So we had the lone wolf thing. It had never been heard of before. No one had really used that phrase in Australia, but after the PM used it, senior ASIO officials then voluntarily approached the mass media specifically to tell them that they'd been looking into lone wolf stuff.
Well, it's funny you should say that, actually, because just before I had your chat with you, I noticed, and I'm just quickly trying to look for it now, but I probably won't find it. But there was I noticed there was an article talking about terror in relation to Australia again. There's been some other smaller event, but just the constant use, it seems to me that Australia is now being going to be one of the countries where the word terror is going to come up every day now, basically.
Well, look, it's not new in Australia. I spent the second half of 2006 in Australia, and honestly, there would never be more than 2 or 3 days go by without you walking past a newsagent and seeing a huge headline about, something connected with terror. And then I went to New Zealand for a few months to work, and I didn't hear the word terror when I was in New Zealand. Not the whole time I was there. I never heard the word, except when Kiwis would say things like, "Oh, you know, those Australians are very keen on their terror, aren't they?" It was only ever used in connection with Australians and their paranoia about terror. It's been happening for a long time, and the first day I got back, I got off the plane, and what did I see? A big broadsheet with a headline about terror. So just, and this has been, you've got to bear in mind too that Australia actually has more anti-terrorism laws than any other country in the world. And like I said, every year or two, the government just ramps up the paranoia a little bit more and then passes another round of laws. We know that works well in the US and the UK, and it turns out it's working even better in Australia. So, yeah, this is kind of the context of it. But you must admit, I mean, for an intelligence agency to come out and court mass media attention so they can tell everybody what they're doing is a little bit unusual. And look, it also, I mean, the siege also comes on the back of some very coincidental pronouncements of the Australian government, like this lone wolf thing. Now that the siege has happened, the Australian government is talking about reviewing security laws and examining aspects of the legal system, or, in other words, getting flexing its muscles with the independent judiciary. So, I mean, there's a lot to be gained from an incident like this if you're a government who wants to do that kind of thing. I mean, yeah, as I said, the more you look into this, the stranger and fishier it gets. Monis was actually a lifelong devotee of Shia Islam, but about 2 weeks before the siege, he suddenly converted to Sunni Islam, which never happens. And then says IS is attacking Australia, and I don't know. I guess he decided that he had to become Sunni, converting suddenly to Sunni Islam. It's a bit like. Imagine like in the 1980s, a middle-aged, Northern Irish guy suddenly converts from Anglican to Catholic, then goes into the centre of Belfast and opens fire in a shopping centre. It makes no sense unless it was stage managed, which is what we're kind of driving at here. Yeah. But look, I just want to mention one more thing. Mm-hmm. Earlier this year, it was reported in Australia that IS had called for Australian Muslims to carry out street executions, and they'd named Martin Place, where the siege happened, as the best place to do that.